So what's the deal with saying that we are attempting to go from A to B? I mean, when we say that, it's almost always a setup for explaining that we actually went from A to A2, then A3 and A4 before finally arriving at B. A more accurate analogy would be going from 1 to 2 on a ruler because it's already set up to illustrate multiple steps in between. It naturally allows for a 16-step process to get anywhere. This is a very obtuse way of demonstrating that I grew up watching Seinfeld every week. It was a show I was too young to really appreciate, but the characters were often broad and cartoonish enough that I could definitely enjoy their antics, even if I had no idea why Spongeworthy or Mulva were jokes. My interest didn't end when must-see TV did. I bought magazines about the show, and my copy of Sign Language was a treasured item I excitedly purchased from Walden Books with lawn mowing money when it was new to paperback, and I still have it to this day. When that final episode aired, my best friend Matthew came over to my house after school, and we camped out in the living room until it came on later that evening. And then it was gone. Just reruns for the rest of my life. A few years later, Matthew and I were seniors in high school, and I had plans to attend film school afterwards before going on to make the next great film for Troma. Then one day, our government teacher planted a seed in our head. He said that we should all take the year after graduation and just go out into the world, explore and be young, because after college, it would be increasingly harder to have that opportunity, so we should take it now before being saddled with a career in debt and obligations. As usual, I took the wrong parts of this and ran with them. I did plan to take a year off before continuing my education, but instead of exploring the world, I moved out of my parents' house and into my first apartment while taking on more hours at the movie theater I worked at. Instead of taking advantage of a debt-free existence, I got credit cards and married and eventually promoted to head manager of the theater at 18. I did try to stick to my plan of going to film school that next year. I sent in my application and was even accepted. There was a problem, though. The film school was here in Michigan, and in 2002, I was living in Bucyrus, Ohio, 3 hours away. Only a stupid idiot would drive that distance 3 days a week to attend a trade school, and as a full-time manager, it wasn't like I could take the time off to do so anyway. The school did offer a dorm option through a partnership with a nearby Catholic school, but they wouldn't allow my wife and I to live together on their campus. So if I wanted to really do this film school thing, I would need to move to Michigan, but I couldn't get an apartment without a hefty deposit and proof of employment. But I couldn't get employment without an address in the same state I was trying to move to. I was stuck, and the only thing I could think to do was to try and save up enough money to cover a couple of months' rent and hope I could talk my way in somewhere in time for the 2003 school year. As the head manager of a 5-screen movie theater in Bucyrus, Ohio, I was making a weekly wage of $350, which even in 2002 dollars was barely enough for 2 people to live on and pay rent. My wife was, let's be generous and say, inconsistently employed. Saving money wasn't going to happen quickly, if at all. Then, one fateful day, my friend Matthew, whom I had gotten a job with me at my theater, informed me he was quitting because he had started a new job. That new job had a starting wage equal to my current salary and offered raises and the potential for weekly bonuses. My immediate response was, "Are they hiring?" And he said that they were, indeed. There was a catch, though. The job was at a call center, telemarketing. But not just regular telemarketing. This call center specialized in making outbound cold calls on behalf of various Republican organizations. I was raised in a staunchly Republican household, but by the time I had graduated high school, I was more apolitical than anything else. My wife was raised Democrat, and I had recently discovered the films and books of Michael Moore, so I wasn't really up to date on the GOP. Matthew informed me that this would absolutely be a subject which would come up in the interview. But somehow he had gotten hired, so it Couldn't be that hard to get in despite a lack of interest in politics. There's a lot about this brief chapter of my life I'm not proud of, but one thing I will always brag about is that I'm pretty sure I'm the only person to ever get a job working for a conservative organization by using Michael Moore as a positive example of my thoughts on politics. It may have also been the thinly veiled desperation and likely bad attempts at lying that got me in the door. Either way, they hired me and I began working a second job in a misguided and hopeless attempt to save money and move out of state the following year. For those who have never had the displeasure, working at a call center is actually a pretty easy job once you turn off your humanity. All you have to do is show up at a nondescript brick building, take your place at one of many little cubicles, post up your script or scripts for the shift, watch the computer screen for incoming calls, very quickly absorb the information about the caller and which script to use before unmuting your headset, and then just read. If the person the computer called doesn't hang up, then just follow the pre-written responses to whatever they say, collect their credit card info, say goodbye, and then repeat for 8 hours. This call center during normal times would run 3 or 4 different fundraising campaigns, but since I started working there in October of 2002, a midterm election year, we were running almost exclusively one script for the Republican National Committee, a group that bankrolls most Republican election campaigns. We raised a lot of money every day just at our one little call center, and we were far from the only one operating on their behalf. If you don't recall, the Republicans won big that election, and I can't help but feel a little bit responsible. So, I would just like to take a second here to apologize for my actions at that time. I'm sorry. It wasn't all misery, though. Sometimes there were amusingly stupid things that happened, like my friend Matthew taking so many caffeine pills to stay awake on the job that he thought he was having a heart attack. He wasn't, but he did get to leave early that day. I once worked a Sunday shift, which was the absolute worst because nobody wants to talk politics with a telemarketer in general, but especially not on a Sunday. I ended up with one woman on the line who began screaming at me for interrupting her family's meal. My favorite quote from her is, "You shouldn't be calling people on Sunday, it's fucking family day." Most of the time it really was just misery, though. The worst call I had to do was for an NRA campaign. An old man answered, and he let me go through my entire opening paragraph about how the evil Democrats would stop at nothing to take our guns, just like the Nazis did in Germany. And the only thing that can stop them is a donation right now. He then informed me that his son had recently committed suicide by using one of the old man's handguns. There was not a pre-written response for that scenario in my script, so I began apologizing and backing out of the call. The old man then proceeds to tell me that I didn't need to call back later because he would love to donate now, in his son's honor. Each week we were given an evaluation and a score on our abilities to follow the script and correctly handle rebuttals, etc. There was also a list of top money earners each week. According to my training and bosses, doing well on the first would naturally lead to success in the second. Every single week I worked there, I was the only person to achieve a perfect score on the evaluation, and at the time held the longest streak for doing so. And yet, every single week, I was solidly in the middle or towards the bottom of the list for earnings. There were lucrative bonuses for the top earners, but nothing for the top evaluation scores. Which meant despite being the literal best employee in the company by their own metrics, I was still only making the same amount of money I was making at the movie theater, but with the extra expense of my soul and additional trips to the gas station. A couple weeks after the election, I got my first evaluation that wasn't a perfect score. I lost 1 point for some minor wording change I made. A couple days later, I quit. My goal of making extra money to put into savings was a failure. A couple months later, I came home to find my wife in bed with another man. My marriage was also a failure. I left my apartment and moved back in with my parents. I was a failure. I had gone from 1 inch to 1 3/16, and then back to 1. back to where I'd started 2 years earlier. The nice thing about going back to the beginning is you can try a different path towards the same goal. Sometimes it's actually easier to try a whole new path rather than trying to force the one you're on to bend in a certain direction. My second path was also a failure, sort of a rerun of the previous year. On my third try, I found the woman I would later marry and am still with 18 years later. I also finally attended film school in 2004 while still living at my parents' house by driving 7 hours round trip 3 days a week while working part-time at an ice cream shop. I graduated in 2005 and was then finally able to move to Michigan with the help of a classmate, and now I'm here on your screen, in front of a microphone, just like my childhood hero Jerry Seinfeld at the beginning of every episode of his definitely not for children TV series.